Hi, listeners. Cass here with content warnings for this week's episode. We are talking about some pretty heavy topics this week, so I want to go ahead and give you a warning that topics this week include, but are not limited to, and brief mentions of classism, racism, cannibalism, residential schools, genocide, colonization, abuse, misogyny, child neglect and murder, the disproportionate rate of kidnapping, abuse, and murder of Indigenous women, violent animal death, graphic descriptions of murder and death, anti-blackness, and body horror. It is a bit of a doozy. It is absolutely understandable. If you need to take care of yourself, that is always the priority. If you're sticking around, though, let's get into the episode.
Remember how Tumblr used to think that people would actually pay for themes? Can't relate.
Hello, and welcome to Author's Note.
Don't listen.
My name is Cass.
And my name is Tease.
And my name is London.
Yay!
Welcome.
Hello.
Welcome, London. London's my best friend.
Wow.
The nepotism once again has jumped.
Shocking. London is my very good pal. They are, how do I describe? Peaches. Sorry, Peaches had a little wolf.
How do you describe Peaches?
How do you describe
Airplane.
Airplane.
Table.
Bark bark. London is my good pal. Known them for not a long time, but it feels like I've known them forever.
Long enough.
Long enough. London is also the person who makes the fun, sexy little earrings I'm always wearing and always advertise on my Twitter account. So if you've ever seen me hold all of my Twitter feed at gunpoint, that's London's Etsy shop. But hi. And London, what are you telling us about today?
Well, I want to ask you a question.
Yeah.
Hold on.
Wait.
Yes.
We have to talk about media we've consumed.
Oh,
so first of all,
my bad. My bad.
London, have you consumed any media this week?
My girlfriend and I have been obsessed with this game called Inscription.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's a roguelike card game and also escape room game. Kind of like set in an old ramshackle building, and you have to find different clues around the area and solve different puzzles while also playing a card game.
I love a ramshackle little building. I love
It's
to
really
go
fun.
spelunking in a nasty little place.
Yeah. I've been playing it too, but not as much as London has, so.
I have like over 8 hours logged now.
There we go. Congratulations.
The
I think I have
power.
like an hour in.
And I just got it, so.
Anything else, London, or just mostly sitting with Inscription?
Mostly just sitting with Inscription.
Nice. Sounds good. Cass, what about you? Yeah.
So I'm currently sitting in line to
Yeah?
play Final Fantasy 14.
Okay.
So that's pretty much been my week. I know it didn't
Yeah.
come out like too far into the week, but I've only played a little bit, and tonight's the first night I really get to play some more. So I'm excited
Nice.
about that. But I've been reading my book. I watched the season finale of this series of Bake Off, and I was really, really happy with the winner. I won't spoil anything for people who haven't caught up, but I think it was a really delightful season. And I would have been happy with any of the people who won, but the person who won was my favorite. So I felt
Agreed.
personally, just very attached.
Yeah.
I'm really excited to see who it is then.
It's really good. Yeah.
It's very good. It's very, very good.
I'm on the very last episode, so we're about halfway through that, but
Oh, nice.
gotta finish it.
Wonderful.
You'll enjoy it.
Cass, did you also finish Brotherhood yet, or are you still
No,
coasting
I'm
on
taking
that?
my time with it. So I get to a significant moment, and then I kind of chill out with it for a little bit, and I wait a few days before I watch some more episodes. So that I'm
Love
really
that for you.
percolating and taking everything in.
That's a good way
Wow.
to do it.
You are
Mhm.
so smart, unlike me. So.
Well, you're taking your time with Hannibal, so...
Yeah, because I've been watching it with my mom.
But you also haven't, steamed through every single series of it, when you have.
Yeah.
I know that you're ahead of her, technically, but you haven't been, sprinting through it in your free time.
Since she said that she's wanted to watch it with me, I've stopped. I've been slowly watching with her, but right now we're watching the second season of Succession, and we're halfway through that now, and My God, so many things happened in that season.
What is that show about?
So, a lot of people have been asking me this week, actually. So, Succession is an HBO series, and the same way that Breaking Bad was kind of like a drama with comedic elements, Succession is really similar to that. It is about a family, the Roys. They own a media conglomerate, and Logan Roy is in his, I don't want to say his twilight years, but his age is starting to begin to affect him, and he has 4 children, and he needs to start thinking about who his successor will be for him. So the first episode opens up with him having I don't remember if it's a heart attack or a stroke, but something serious happens to him, and it makes him kind of have to sit and realize his mortality and kind of start having to think about the future with the company without him. And so this whole series is basically about his whole family and what kind of happens in the ebbs and the flows of the company that he runs, how his children are reacting, what his children do. He has 4 children, and of course, they're all messes. None of them have ever clearly been hugged in their life. Like, they are rancid adults, and it's
so very human drama.
Oh, yes, definitely. And I can't stop watching it. And it's one of those shows that you can't even feel terrible for them in moments where there's sadness, because they're all terrible to each other. And it's like a train wreck. You can't look away. And it's really good. It's well written, and I really like it. I know friend of the show Jay is also watching it right now, and I just like it. I'm not immune to prestige television, as we all know. So just doing what I gotta do, I guess.
London, it's time for you to take the floor and take over for this week's episode. So how would you like us to start out?
Oh boy. Well, I do have a question for you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Both of you.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm Native American. I'm Oglala from the Pine Ridge Reservation, South Dakota. What do you guys think, as non-native people, what native horror may be?
Cass.
So I get to be put on the spot first.
Well, no, because I have answers too, but I feel like
that's fair. Yeah. I would assume native horror is anything that has to do. I think anyone from the outside, like myself included, would initially launch toward it being more based in folklore, right? But I feel like there's probably an arm and extension of it that deals also with like the very modern struggles and objectively horror of being native in America right now. So I would imagine it's quite a wide and varied genre that is just sort of all connected by a root of, the shared experience of being native, despite how diverse I imagine that is.
Tease?
Oh, I think a lot of what Cass said was a really good way to encapsulate all of that. And I think us talking about this pretty often, I know this is something that the two of us are like, you clearly have way more knowledge and understanding on the subject than I do, but I feel like we also talk about it a lot together, I know, in our own personal friendship. And I feel like a lot of it does have to do with class and inner turmoil and racism and just the experience and the generational trauma that happens, I feel like. But then there's also a lot of revenge stories. There's a lot of conversation about treatment and movement within media, I feel like, is definitely one of them. And I feel like native horror is just the same way how we talk about why is horror so white, and then we have fantastic African, like for instance His House, I know, was very heavily rooted in African horror and stuff like that, and a lot of it did have to do with folklore and stuff similar to what Cass said. And I think a lot of that is kind of similar with native horror as well, because I know there's things like, for instance, A Few Good Indians, like I didn't finish reading, but I have 40 pages left of it. I know Bone Tomahawk was something that came out recently, and that was kind of a little bit more campy and like natives eating people, and I was like, oh, is it really though?
I don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, I know, there's like, I feel like Bone Tomahawk is one of those things that people like are either like they love it or they hate it, and I think it definitely has to do with how many Native American people you actually know.
Yeah, more or less.
Yeah, shocker. And I think it's, Cass said it way more succinct and better than I did.
Can I ask a heavy question right off the bat without knowing anything about Bone Tomahawk?
Mm-hmm.
I am wondering, like, because there's been a lot of discussions about this in regards to like Jordan Peele's work, right? Of like
Mm-hmm.
the frustration with black horror being so synonymous with like racial suffering is like this question that I think every marginalized community deals with, right? Of the stories that are representative for you and that are, you know, empowering to you are not going to be empowering to everyone. Is that the case with Bone Tomahawk? Again, I asked this knowing nothing about this movie.
I don't know, London. That's a question for you, I'd say, because I haven't actually seen all of Bone Tomahawk. I've only just seen bits and pieces about it.
I've also
honestly.
only seen bits and pieces too.
Oh.
So
Oops, we bungled that one, both of us.
a bit.
I can cut that part out.
If you want, I mean, but I would assume yes, right? I mean, that sounds like a pretty fair assumption to make. I mean, if listeners, if you've watched Bone Tomahawk, if you have opinions on it, I feel like that might be something valid to start a conversation about. We could always bring back a little comment corner at the end of the episodes.
I'm just going to say, even with a piece of work, if any of the producers, the executive producers, the writers are Native American, it's still not speaking from every Native American's perspective.
Yeah, that's
There's
true.
way too many factors to think about. There's way too many people to consider.
Yeah.
It's always going to be offensive to someone.
Yeah.
And it's always going to hurt someone.
Yeah.
But others might enjoy it, of course. So it's a 50-50 split.
Yeah, I think that's the important thing with like any sort of media, right? Is like this discussion of like it's not necessarily about finding perfect representation or the perfect story. And obviously some stories do more harm than good in various circumstances, but the more representation there is, the more variance you can find and the more likely you are to find your own story. Because I do think it's like it's already interesting to me that it's like, all right, we're talking about African horror, we're talking about native horror. Africa's a massive continent, right?
Yes.
And it's like being native is an experience that is going to differ from like I imagine tribe to tribe. So it's just one of those things where it's like we have these very wide genres that we're asking to encompass so much, and one single piece of media isn't going to be able to carry the back of all of that.
Yeah.
Exactly. Especially with how many tribes are just in the United States and Canada, you can't possibly cover all of those, let alone also the ones in Africa, also North and South America, and the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a pretty heavy question to start out with. So I was like,
no, it's good. This is a good beginning to a really great conversation. I'm really excited for this episode. I know this has been something that we've been talking about for a while, so I'm really excited for this.
Our last few episodes have been kind of goofy, so it's totally fine if we have like a really heavy hit.
Okay. I wasn't sure about that.
No, you're fine.
Get as heavy as you like.
You guys pretty much hit the nail on the head on what Native American horror basically is. It's something that brings forth real problems and fears of people it encapsulates. It blends in spiritual and supernatural elements sometimes, but at the end of the day, it's a reflection of real-world issues that many Indigenous people have faced or still face to this day. A lot of us are told stories, legends, old folklore, things that grow into superstitions as children and never really leave you in adulthood. I don't actively participate in any religions myself, but I still do consider my dad's spiritual teachings as something other than that, something kind of outside of the confines of what most people might consider a structured religion now. Spirituality and organized religion, quite a bit different from each other. Just want to point that out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know Cass and I have definitely talked about that as well. Like, there's a very big difference between how organized religion exists and how people relate to it. Like, I know I'm not religious either, but there's definitely like some tones of, I don't even consider myself really spiritual either, but I know there's like one or two things and I'm like, maybe this is spirituality, maybe it's not. So that totally makes sense that exists, across the board.
And there's different types of spirituality too, like all across the board. But anyway, this is a really prominent theme in a book by an author called Shane Hawk, called Anoka. These stories really never leave you. They are a part of you. And the 6 short stories in this book really help to get that point across. They cover curses and spells passed down through generations, which is a really big popular trope now too, to the ideas of trickster spirits imitating a loved one, which also appears in so much media. This idea dates back to who knows when, the time of wandering tribes, even before that. just the idea of something impersonating someone close to you or doing something like mimicking their voice from another room is enough to get you thinking. It's an idea that really sits with you.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know about you too, but I'm really creeped out by that.
Yeah,
It's
and
scary.
I think that's not an unpopular, I don't want to say popular or unpopular, but that is a theme which appears across spiritualities and practices, like even outside and even within organized religion, right? Is like just this idea of either, impersonating, be it fae folk or spirits or just presences that, seek
Exactly.
to misguide you in some way.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly.
It
And the
goes hand in
closer
hand.
the
Yeah.
closer it gets to someone like or someone that you love, your own parents,
Mm-hmm.
the closer to home it gets, the
Yeah.
more it starts to stick with you.
Well, and I think a lot of that too is like when you look at horror, right? How much of our fear in horror is built around the idea of the uncanny valley and like that tie-in, right? And there
Mm-hmm.
are so many different anthropological arguments of why humans have developed this fear of the uncanny valley, but I do really enjoy like this exploration of it, of like your brain knows that maybe there is something not quite right there, but this is a person who is so dear to you, right, that like you don't even want to fathom that question. Oh.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also from just like from a standpoint of just how this could possibly stem. I mean, there's so many animal cries that sounds like a baby's cry, or you're thinking about somebody and
Foxes.
Foxes
your voice
especially.
plays a trick on you. You know what I mean? So I see how this is a cultural concept
Mm-hmm.
across multiple groups of people, but I feel like especially I've noticed within the native horror that I have been exposed to that has been a really big topic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of
So
the main
yeah.
trickster spirits in um my heritage is coyote,
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
which is also something that kind of mimics something crying out in the woods.
Yeah, definitely.
And he's a trickster spirit that it depends on the story, but he usually can turn into someone else, can mimic someone else,
Mm-hmm.
leads people astray. There's another spirit that's the spider spirit, Iktomi. They work together sometimes, they trick each other, sometimes they're enemies. It depends on the story, but they've been known to mimic people to a T,
Mm-hmm.
and you never know what they're going to do. So,
Spooky,
yeah.
unsettling. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so that's just always in the back of your mind because you're told
Mm-hmm.
that from the time that you're little.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a story that sticks with you.
Mm-hmm. It's
And
like the idea of like the changelings, you know, how
Mm-hmm.
it's like you're the fae can steal your baby, and the fear of not having control over yourself or somebody not being who they are. I feel like is something that is universal even now to some degree. I
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
feel like
definitely.
big fear, big fear. Yeah.
There's also a lot of stories about transformation, not only into another person, but to another creature or spirit altogether. The idea that things walking among us are more than they appear to be or are capable of being more. A lot of these stories coincide with the European idea of a werewolf or a were creature, someone that can take the form of another creature by mystical means or a curse. These are associated with usually the Southwest tribes, but also the Plains tribes a lot. It's usually through magical means, sometimes it's shamanistic means, sometimes it involves owning the pelt of an animal, sometimes it is a curse. Anoka, the book I was talking about, has a really interesting werewolf story in it that kind of wraps up the entire book, but it also highlights a real life issue, which is widespread poverty on reservations.
Mm-hmm.
It goes in depth about talking about limited food and housing resources and food banks being the main source of supply for the general population.
Mm.
Not only that, but it focuses on real issues that plague Indigenous communities past and present, whether it be addiction, alcoholism that leads to other medical conditions, diabetes, heart disease, other things, as well as leaving families vulnerable to physical and emotional abuse, to reservation poverty, to the huge crisis of missing and murders of Indigenous women. These topics could be a whole different episode, but this book covers every single one of them, highlights them, and really brings them to your attention without using shock value,
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
which is a really big thing.
What I will do for this episode as well is I will curate a list of all of the resources London mentions in the bottom to links where you can either purchase these books, not through giant corporations, but hopefully local bookstores. But I'll make sure that those are all listed down below.
But basically, I really just want people to be aware that Indigenous communities have struggles beyond that what appears to be at first glance. I can't count how many people I know that didn't know a thing about the heavy abuse towards Native women or about residential schools until major news broke or a few activist Twitter threads said something. I've met people that didn't even know Native Americans still existed, which has been a trip.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
But point being, it takes shock value for people to notice these things. Just a quick rundown of what residential schools are. They're extremely, or were extremely underfunded compulsory attendance schools in Canada and the US, meant to assimilate First Nations people into the general population and extinguish their culture, language, and family connections. There are a number of reported deaths at these institutions due to lack of food, clothing, housing, the spread of disease, general neglect, as well as other much more gruesome factors. But we're continuously finding more and more unmarked mass graves of thousands of children that needlessly suffered through these schools. Media sources keep digging for more and more gruesome details without really paying mind to the fact that this was literally a strategic genocide. And again, it takes shock value like this for something to be noticed. As for missing Indigenous women, that's something that slips under the radar a lot more. It's something that's claimed to be looked at and to be examined, but honestly, a history of racism and prejudice towards First Nations people kind of leaves a lot of the cases unreported. And those that seem to be are put on the back burner, for lack of a better term. But in some communities, Native women face murder rates 10 times that of the national average. And in 2020, over 9,500 cases involving Indigenous people were reported, and nearly 1,500 were still active cases at the end of 2020. So all of these things listed in Anoka, all of these things listed in the books I'm going to talk about, are all real life horror. That's the thing. Native communities face oppression and issues that no one ever really sees unless it's brought to light on social media platforms. And even that, the novelty fades. Interest in it fades. The community's left barren with little or no support from parties that once cared for the cause with what they called a passion. You know, people who post about it like 10 times a day and then just kind of drop it.
And I also feel like, especially if you kind of reach the same audience over and over again, it just kind of becomes a part of the background. Like, I know
exactly,
even as bad as it sounds, like sometimes if, like, for instance, I know people be like, oh, I need money, and like we'll post a GoFundMe. Like the first time I see it, I'm like, okay, cool, I'll retweet it, like blah blah blah, or okay, I'll donate to it, and then they keep retweeting it or they keep reblogging it or something like that. Like, oh, there it is again. Oh, there it is again. And you just kind of think like, well, did I not do enough by giving money? Or, oh, did I not do enough if I spread awareness and something like that? And I feel like that also goes for almost in a way like pop culture. Like, for instance, I remember when Rhyme for Young Ghouls came out a few years back, and I remember people were like, oh my gosh, this is so good, you gotta watch it on Netflix. And then that also sparked a conversation about residential schools. But then how long did that conversation last? You
exactly
know? And
social media and the news cycle are not empathetic machines. They are meant for viewership and keeping people engaged in a really disturbing way that trains our mind away from active help. And I think it's there's a horror in it too, right? Where it's like you become so used to the barrage of constant horrifying things like this on your feed that you feel so overwhelmed. But don't let perfection be the enemy of good. It's still important to reach out and get involved wherever you can, obviously, to the best of your capability, and to make sure that you're sort of microdosing on news in safe and healthy levels, that you don't spiral.
24-hour news cycle is a mess.
That's what I was going to say, too. I mean, if these are obviously very, very heavy topics. So if you do look into them with care, look into them with caution, and like Cass said, microdose it. It's a lot of information. It's a lot of background. It's a lot of history. And it's a lot that's still going on and still happening now.
Yeah.
So if you do decide to look into either the history of residential schools, reservation poverty, anything like that, just take it slow.
Mm-hmm.
Getting back to that transformation bit.
Yeah.
Let's derail that. There's a lot of stories about spirits, malevolent or otherwise, teaching people important lessons or bearing warnings to ward off bad behavior. And this is where we get into a really classic Indigenous tale, and the specifics change from tribe to tribe, but she's known as the Deer Woman or the Elk Woman.
Mm-hmm.
In some cases, she appears as a seductress and targets unfaithful men, ultimately leading to their death. In other tales, she seeks vengeance against ones that have wronged her people or gone against tribal rule.
I love her. Incredible
She's
stuff.
Girl
Great
boss.
news, Cass.
Girl boss.
I got
Gaslight
a book for you.
gatekeep girl boss. Is turning into
actually
some
is.
sort of non-human creature not the ultimate gaslight gatekeep girl boss?
It truly is. In this case, it actually is.
What an icon.
But the legend of the Elk Woman is explored really, really well in a book by Stephen Graham Jones called The Only Good Indians. And from here on out, it's going to be spoilers for that book.
Sorry, Tease.
40 pages. I just had not even 40. It was 35 at the point we started.
I'm mostly going to be talking about the first part of the book because the second part gets
Perfect.
into some pretty gory stuff.
Yeah.
Some pretty heavy stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing has convinced me to read this book more than the last few seconds of you talking about it.
Cass, you can borrow my copy. I'll bring it to you.
Please read it.
It's good. I really liked it. Oh, just from a reading and writing standpoint. Sorry to derail the conversation, but I really appreciated the personality within the actual narrative and the writing. I thought the way that the author kind of wove all of their stories as well as the narrator's story combined. I'm really enjoying it. Trust me reading over 100 pages today was not by choice, but has been enjoyable.
At least you're enjoying it.
Yeah.
Unlike a certain other book that I'm 150 pages
Dude?
in right now. No.
Oh, Gideon?
Yeah.
But the author puts a lot of himself into his work as well.
Okay.
A lot of his experiences and a lot of the people he knows too, to some degree. But the first main part of the story centers around a Blackfeet man named Lewis, who believes he's being haunted by something. Because years prior, he and 3 of his other friends went against the tribal tradition and illegally hunted a herd of elk in the elder section of the reservation. That might not mean a lot to a lot of people, but that is extremely, extremely disrespectful to the elders, the elk spirits, the elk themselves, and to the park game ranger because they were forced to put everything they had back.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
When we refer to elders, are we talking about living presently alive elders or spiritual elders who have
Both.
passed on? Oh, okay.
Both.
Good to know.
Yeah, elders kind of encompasses all of that.
Okay.
So he comes to believe that not only is one of the elk spirits, who was a young mother elk that he had shot, is seeking revenge on him for breaking tradition, as well as killing her unborn calf, but is stalking him in the form of those around him, even though he swore to use and honor every part of her, from the meat to the pelt and so forth. So there's a strong belief that everything has a spirit, every animal has a spirit. That spirit must be honored when taking a life, even if it's for survival means. You typically would honor an animal by using every part of it, like the pelt, the meat, the bones, the sinew, the organs, literally everything.
Mm-hmm.
And it's extremely disrespectful to leave anything unattended. What happens in the story, in addition to the men hunting on sacred ground, they're unable to properly carry and use every part of the elk that they hunted due to being caught by the game warden. Lewis buries the calf he killed and barely makes it out of there with the pelt and the meat, the latter of which he distributes to the elders of the tribe. Again, going back to reservation poverty and a lot of the elders living in almost squalor. It depends where we're talking about, but There's really a lot of places that rely mainly on food banks, and food banks are not that reliable in these situations.
Mm.
Some people don't even have refrigerators. Some people don't have stoves. Whatever you receive, you have to, if it's fresh, you have to eat it that day.
I think what a lot of people, especially who grow up more comfortably or with more reliable food sources, is they don't understand the concept of a food desert, and like how you can walk into a grocery store that is quite literally barren, or you only have the option of one brand of something and it is exclusively that brand. And I don't think people understand either that the kind of damage that um, a mega corporation like Walmart or Amazon can do, and how that is the only option a lot of people have, because they put out these like very small businesses that did have necessities, and now people just aren't able to access them at all because mail trucks won't come. It's just, it is this terrible web of systems failing in the worst ways possible and really harming communities in ways that are visible but that no one works to fix on a structural level. That's really infuriating.
No, truly. So honoring providing for the elders is a given, but with food shortages on reservations, like we just talked about, especially in the winter, this is good as a gesture as he can manage. Since he couldn't honor every part of the animal. So, meanwhile, he begins to see visions of the elk in various forms, and after he finds his dog stomped to death by unknown means, he starts to believe that, yeah, yikes, big yikes.
Big yikes.
Big yikes. He starts to believe that one of the women in his life is actually the elk spirit come to take revenge. As his paranoia increases, he winds up trying to confirm his suspicion by killing this woman.
Buddy. Buddy, that seems like the worst move.
Oh boy, it's
he scalps
gruesome.
her with an exposed motorcycle engine.
Buddy? Hey friend? Hey pal?
And the worst part is he actually doubts him, he thinks to himself, this is not a good idea. This should not happen. And then it happens.
And it happens, and then he's like, oh, maybe she wasn't the elk spirit. Maybe I shouldn't have done that.
Let me destroy her teeth and check if they're ivory or just fucking teeth.
just to make sure.
The idea too that it's like, something from another plane has come to get revenge on me. I should kill it in a very, very brutal way. That definitely won't make other entities more upset at all.
Exactly. He's not even thinking of that at this point. All of he's thinking of is the fact that his wife thinks he's cheating with this woman. Because the elk woman is known to be a seductress. So he gets so caught up in that fact and what happened to his dog, which was extremely brutal and extremely well written, to be quite honest.
Oh my gosh, Cass, from a writing standpoint, the way that the setup that these honestly horrible moments happen, it happens so quickly and so easily with fluidity that it's like a blink and you miss it. You're like, holy shit, this guy is all of a sudden
Cass
dead.
goes on a fun and sexy little errand tomorrow to pick up this book when he does his mail run.
It's big tasty. I think you're really gonna like it if you do read it.
It's really good. You'll read one sentence right into the other, and it won't even phase you the first time what just happened.
God, I fucking wish that was the book I'm currently reading. I'm coming for you,
we are both
Christopher
suffering.
Bullman. We have to have a chat.
So after he literally checks her teeth to see if they are ivory, to see if they are elk teeth, and confirming for himself that she was not the elk spirit, he begins to suspect his wife as well. And she meets the same fate.
No.
He also lets her die.
No.
She is on a ladder trying to fix something, and he does not catch her when she falls. She cracks her head on a mantle, and she bleeds to death.
Is there a part of this book that, is a commentary on the brutalization of Indigenous women and sort of the apathy of men in the community?
There is, to a degree. His wife was a white woman,
Mm.
So in that sense, I'm not saying that's also not a bad thing,
Mm-hmm.
but there is to some degree how it's commentary on how Native women are belittled
Mm.
primarily
Mm-hmm.
or looked down upon, even in a modern setting.
Mm-hmm.
Just not as up to par as a Native man would be as far as worth,
Mm.
even to an outside community.
Mm-hmm.
But once he kills his wife, he finds out his wife was pregnant and proceeds to take the baby out of her womb, only to find an elk calf in its place.
This is the kind of stuff I adore in horror.
Yeah.
So the bodies are soon discovered, and Lewis is shot to death with the elk calf still in his arms.
Oof.
The story picks back up, but it briefly gives the point of view of the spirit, who up to this point has been questionably real.
Mm-hmm.
But after growing from an elk calf to a mature woman in a matter of perhaps 2 pages,
Yeah, 3 days tops.
3 days tops,
Yeah.
in time, and assuring the death of Lewis and everyone he loved, she moved on to the next offenders, Lewis's friends, Cass and Gabe.
I would never.
2 S's.
Two
It's short for
S's.
Cassidy.
Yeah, it's Cass. It's Cassidy. It's okay.
Cass. C ass. That's what it is.
It's C Acidy.
C ass.
Every time somebody has ever misspelled my name with 2 S's instead of 1, I do go, there's no ass in my name.
But I had mentioned another friend of his that went on the elk hunt. His name was Ricky. He had been beaten to death in a bar fight directly next to a herd of onlooking elk
Spectators.
before
there
the
for the
story
show.
even began.
Mm-hmm.
So it's up to the reader at this point to determine what they do and don't believe about what's really going on, what's supernatural, what's not. But from a Native American's perspective, it just made sense for me, at
Mhm.
least. Everything just kind of clicked and I accepted it for what it was. I'm not
Mhm.
sure if someone not of the same descent would see it that way. Tease, when you were reading it, how did you see it?
So I immediately got it. I immediately went the way that the elk are described within. So they first portray Ricky's death, and it's kind of immediate. Like we know that Ricky died relatively a few months after the original Thanksgiving classic, as they call it, because it does happen a week before Thanksgiving, which I also think is something to say. And when they described the elk, I was like, there's no reason why this elk A should be acting this way, and B, that this whole entire group of elk are being onlookers without running away of fear. I mean, it was essentially like a loud, drunk crowd that attacked Ricky to some degree, and it's like these elk would have been startled or would have moved away, and yet there's clearly, even though you can't really see vengeance in the eyes of an elk, it was obvious that something was there immediately for me. And then once we got to more of the story unfolding, I was like, oh, this makes sense. And then when the elk woman kind of takes over the narrative and talks about the generational remembrance of suffering, I was like, oh, this makes big sense. So yeah, I caught it immediately myself too, but also I'm just a very empathetic person, and like I said, because we do talk about this often and we do have
Right.
conversations about it. I mean, I don't know if this would be immediate for somebody that doesn't have critical thinking skills or has some acknowledgement and understanding, but tasty. It was tasty for me. I will
No, it
say.
really was.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole reason Ricky being outside was he was trying to stop a rampaging elk
Mm-hmm.
from destroying all of these white people's cars,
Mm.
only to be beaten to death by said white people with some onlooking elk. I don't know. It was just written in a very, very tasty way.
I
It's
mean,
immediate
deer
revenge.
and ungulates in general do get up to some shit. I remember a few years back in Montana, there was a slew of white-tailed deer attacking people and like
Really?
entering
Really?
into their homes and trying to get into their cars, and like there people were very afraid of the deer. And it's like, I think we look at them, not so much elk, but deer especially, we look at so much as these creatures of like peace and a settled nature and a sort of unclaimed nature, and it's like, no, they can do some damage.
Oh,
They got
They're
moves
big
for a
animals.
reason.
Yeah. It's like people always underestimate moose because they're like, oh, it's just big deer. And it's like, no, you do not understand. That
They're
creature's
big.
torso does not start until above your head. Everything else is leg down. Oh, terrifying. If you see a moose, I'm sorry, it's too late for you. It's too
I
late.
wish to see one. I would like to see one.
We
I
can
want to
go
see
an
one
natural
from a
history
safe
museum.
distance.
Yeah.
Big.
Maybe an elk too, from a safe distance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
Family trip.
they're pure muscle.
Mm-hmm.
They're
This
absolutely
sounds
pure
like it.
muscle.
I'm afraid.
I know Nico loves to tell this story about it was an image that did the rounds for quite a while of two bull elk which had gotten into, some sort of altercation with each other, but the one had literally decapitated the other on its horns,
Yeah,
and
I've
its
seen
head
that.
was just stuck rotting on top of the other's antlers for days, weeks. It's like they're powerful animals. I think we discount the danger that herbivores can present, but those are animals that have evolved to survive horrifying apex predators. Like, these are our megafauna. Pay respect to them for living.
Right, especially elk, especially deer.
Mm-hmm.
Do not underestimate a deer either.
Mm-hmm.
I need to look something.
What are you looking up?
Head.
When you get in a fight as a bull elk and you don't end up with your enemy's decapitated head on your antlers, so no head.
Oh, good God. Oh, good gravy.
I remember seeing a deer years ago that had clearly lost its leg in some sort of altercation and must have been rehabbed in some capacity. But this boy was still trucking. He was just walking around eating. I was like, oh, hello. They're incredible.
They're way stronger than they're given credit for.
Mm-hmm.
Back to the book.
We just love deer in this house. They're
We
great.
do
Can't
love
help
deer.
it.
We love deer, we love elk. So a whole slew of incidents occur with Cass and Gabe, some of which include their dogs getting stomped to death again, events that create hostility and distrust between the two friends, and the eventual slow demise of them and their loved ones as well. The end of the story is probably the most confusing for non-native readers, as there's more shape-shifting and a chase scene that leads to the gravesite of the massacred elk all those years ago. Here's where the elk woman finds peace, as she digs at the spot where Lewis had buried her dead calf, only to find it reborn, and sheds her humanity to carry on a new life with it.
Nice.
Now,
That makes me feel better.
some questions stand. Did they actually turn into elk? Are their spirits going to Wankantanka? That's the Great Spirit, or referring to things transversing out of this world into the next. And to the non-native viewer especially, did any of this actually happen? It's a hard question to answer when you're reading from two different backgrounds. So as a native reader, this is something I can question, in my own terms. But Tease, when you were reading it, how did you feel?
So I didn't finish it, like I said. So I didn't
Right,
get to
never
that
mind.
scene yet. But I from what I have read, I feel like, yes, I feel like this did happen, because I don't think suddenly friends like this would turn on each other. I mean, the catalyst for Gabe and Cass dying was essentially partially money, partially the dogs, and they both trusted each other to know where this $900 was, where this engagement ring was, and stuff like that. That I don't think that would have naturally happened. And even Lewis knew that he just wanted Shani to be his friend. He constantly keeps mentioning it. And all of this stuff, it feels like there's almost a suggestion that the way that this stuff happens, it seems like fate, but also something tipped the scales of fate to begin with. And with it being the elk woman, it makes sense that everything was able to line up as a domino effect. So for me, at least, I feel like this does happen, because the way how we talk about karma and the way that we talk about respecting, and just for me, it makes sense that this does happen, even if people don't necessarily realize that them around them, because they don't know what truly happened, because the four of them don't really tell many people what they did 10 years ago. So to me, I feel like it's real. Like it wasn't made up, but it was
Right.
more of a supernatural experience. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see if you don't know the story of the spirit of the elk woman or the deer woman, you can see it as some sort of karmic event too.
Yeah.
You could see it in quite a few different lights, I think. But
Mhm.
it's always interesting to hear your viewpoint too.
Thanks.
So, First Nations horror often incorporates spirituality and folklore into it as well, and these things are very much real to us, or have at least been taught to us to some degree. The works I'm mentioning do a great job of this, blurring the lines and mixing folklore and realism, and they kind of weave their own brand of horror. But actually, there's a really good movie that I want to mention too. It came out in 2019 and it's called Blood Quantum. Now, for anybody not aware, this blood quantum refers to laws put into place by the federal government in an effort to limit citizenship in tribes. It basically measures how much Indian blood you have in your heritage, and some tribes still use it as a qualifier. The movie itself is a commentary on colonialism through the eyes of a zombie apocalypse. Basically, a plague breaks out that turns everyone into zombies except those with indigenous blood.
Nice.
So it's a kind of a play on how, when settlers came, many indigenous people were exposed to viruses, their immune systems weren't hardy against it. It's kind of flipping that on its ass. But it's also a reference to a really specific incident in 1981, which I think was in Quebec, where groups of game wardens, fisheries officers, and provincial police raided a reservation, confiscated their fishing equipment, and arrested and beat numerous people. Those people who weren't arrested erected barricades, which caused a second raid of the reservation. The movie had the same premise. The main indigenous cast erected barricades city to protect against the raiding zombies. So I think I'd call it a horror comedy because it does have a lot of really, really ridiculous moments, but it's still a fun time, and I don't know, it's just a good movie, honestly. I don't have much else to say about it, but unfortunately, there's a lot of ways that you can go awry telling native stories, and like everything else, a lot of them has been colonized to no end. A recent example I want to point out is a short story called The Quiet Boy by Nick Antosca, which got adapted into a film recently called Antlers. The original story, upon first reading, is standalone and ambiguous, but the author of said story was one of screenwriters for the movie, and the movie pulls from a very real thing that's part of some indigenous cultures that isn't meant to be spoken of, referenced, or otherwise talked about in any form. And out of respect for those tribes, I won't be speaking name or referencing much about it from this point onwards. But there's been multiple incidents involving this to the point of white people even diagnosing it as a psychosis. So if you're really curious, you can look it up for yourself, but that's all I'm going to mention of it.
There's also a lot of like weird pop culture references to it in a way that makes me uncomfortable.
Exactly. It's tied
Like,
into...
why is there a Monster High doll?
The amount of YouTubers who go on like r/creepypasta or whatever and like read stories about this topic, like
the amount of OCs that people make.
Yeah.
Like, please just make like a weird animal. We just talked about how scary elk are.
Yeah.
Make an elk.
Yeah. Or good pal Slender Man.
Exactly.
He was a little creepy pasta.
Yeah, exactly.
I think people have this idea that pulling from existing ideas in folklore somehow lends their creation more legitimacy, but the issue is like, one, if that's not attached to your lived experiences, you are treading upon ground that is not your own, and you're risking telling stories that aren't yours to tell, right? And like this goes for any kind of folklore, but also too, like you can end up hurting a lot of people in like ways you wouldn't even imagine fathomable, and it's just insensitive. It's just deeply, deeply insensitive.
It's rough to see it taken directly from the source and bastardized for cheap thrills.
Yeah. Because I think people novelize just these ideas and they pull from them because they're like, ooh, it's spooky. And it's like, you're not coming at it with the care, the attention, the intimacy that it actually requires, or any of the context, right? Like we're talking about like the very different ways you could read the endings of this book. And it's like, you can come at it from completely different perspectives, and like that's the importance of art, right? Is the experience you get out of it and how everyone can have a different interpretation, but the context you come to it with is incredibly important.
No, definitely. This isn't the first time this has happened either. A lot of films pull from the same legend, spin it as psychological horror, play it for shock value, and it's really tiring. It's really tiring to see. So, with indigenous spirituality and folklore being used as horror, it can be done, but it has to be respected and taken seriously. And many of these things are very, very much real to us. Some of them not in the literal sense, but it's still an element used in many non-indigenous stories that needs to be approached and treated with respect. There are even more story elements that are derived from native storytelling than you may think, and I can't even begin to scrape the surface of how many Western tropes have origins in Native American legends. All I'm really asking at the end of the day is for people to look at things critically and listen when an indigenous person speaks about ideas, concepts, or elements important to our culture that are being represented unjustly or in a bad light. Like, especially with this movie, one of the producers even tweeted that the story is directly connected to the legend, and in no way is that acceptable.
It had to be him. It just
It had to be him.
It had to be my dad, Guillermo del Toro.
I wasn't going to mention that, but
I was so disappointed. No, I will. Me and my one real parasocial relationship to Guillermo del Toro.
Quick interruption. Spotify Wrapped, I'm fucking coming for you, saying like it's okay to consider your favorite podcaster a member of your family. Stop that. Do you know how hard we've worked?
I do. And all of so many people tagging us like, you guys are in my top 5. I was like, yeah. But I was just like, oh no, Spotify.
Yeah, how many parasocial relationships do you think you guys have?
Guillermo del Toro, Marcus Parr. I understand.
I think ever since doing our episodes, I'm even more acutely aware of it. And so I'm more and more wary of it. And so anytime I feel this sense of like odd disappointment or hurt from a creator that I'm watching, like they say or do something weird on stream, I'm like, no, that's my problem. That's mine to deal with. Like, that's not on them. I'm very... It's gonna sound terrible, but like it does make me like even more uncomfortable when people who I've never spoken to drop into my DMs to talk with me about things I've said in episodes, and I'm just like, I don't know you. That was a conversation I was having with Tease, not with you, you know? Not to say that it's not okay for people to do that, but it's the way in which they go about it. Please don't call me bestie or be fake mean with me.
Oh, God. The fake
meanness. I do say people are welcome to DM us. Yes, I mean, I know both of us have answered before. We always are delighted to hear from you guys and stuff like that, but we're not your friends always.
But also, just to anyone who might not know, I'm not on social media at all this month. That might extend into next month. So if you DM me and I don't answer you, that's why. I literally have Twitter deleted off of...
Come find me.
Yeah. Go bother Tease.
Go for Tease.
Go bother me. I opened up my DM requests again.
Go talk to your dad.
Your grandpa, your people.
Your grandpa Tease. Go for it.
Me. Thanks, guys.
I'm going to tell you some of the interesting spirits that we have now just to kind of lighten things up, because I know this has been a really heavy episode. So we already know about the elk woman or the deer woman, which specifically the deer woman is featured in a show called Reservation Dogs, which is definitely worth a watch if you want some insight about what the res is like, or you just want to support an indigenous cast and crew.
I have also heard, though, that Reservation Dogs is pretty anti-black at times.
Ooh, yikes.
It can be.
Yeah.
I'm going to be honest, it can be. So go in with that warning as well.
Okay.
Thank you for mentioning that.
Not to excuse it, but I think there's an importance to, unfortunately, acknowledging the fact that, like, our society is not, you know, just white people and the collective people of color. And, like, there is, you know, a sort of, you know, interracial discrimination that does happen, and, like, weird race relations that do happen between communities that are really difficult. Not to excuse the presence of anti-blackness in this narrative, but, like, it is a part of the actual American narrative that deserves to be recognized and talked about.
No, it definitely is. And it's something to take. If you do watch Reservation Dogs, take all of that with a grain of salt. And again, do keep in mind that it's not just, like Kat said, white people and POC. As far as spirits, there's Untecula, who a lot of myths are based on as well. She's a giant fiery serpent, but my uncle, who always told stories about her at powwows, always called her a dragon when he was telling the stories because it was easier for kids to understand. There's one story where she fights and wins against a giant black bear whose body then forms Bear Butte in the Black Hills of South Dakota.
Wow. Black Haskell.
Black Haskell.
Black Haskell. You're out there, bud.
He's out there. He's a whole butte.
Wow.
You are a whole butte. Wow, big stretch.
Sorry if that was disrespectful.
It's not. You're fine. There's another story with her where two twin brothers tried to kill her using arrows given to them by a medicine woman, and she writhed away greatly injured and damaged the land as she went, resulting in a lot of the formations found in the Badlands. Or that could have been caused by Eskel too.
Listen, when he's wildin', he just goes off.
Eskel took a big poop and they had the zoomies. That's what happened.
There's also Winyan Nupa, who is the double-faced woman. When she exposes her second face, she paralyzes her target, or in some cases kills them instantly. Most legends say there's only one. Others mention there's an entire race of double-faced women. She tends to target children, pregnant women, and also might be the explanation for children's night terrors. And this is a story that's spread all around the world, too.
Yeah, it's not dissimilar from like the mythos of Gorgons and Medusa, right? Where you have this paralytic face quality. That's so interesting because I know. So Gorgons are also, or the way Gorgons are represented in like Greek imagery is not too far off from the way they're also represented in some South American imagery in native tribes there. And the belief is that, like, because they were represented for so long with, like, their tongues sticking out and their eyes bulging, that they were this sort of human explanation of what happened to waterlogged corpses. And, like, that's where that imagery came from. I just think it's really cool how things travel the world like this. Like, you were talking about the elk in the book, and my mind immediately went to lamb, which is based on Scandinavian folklore, right? Batiste is talking about the vengefulness of an elk, right? And just thinking about the way in which you can very easily sort of project emotion onto an animal like that. And, you know, animals are so much more emotional than we are in so many different ways and just act so differently than we do. And I think humans tend to think of things as being on like a sliding scale of intelligence rather than a sort of spectrum, which I think it's probably more akin to, right? Of just like, it's not that, okay, listen, without getting like too quote unquote hippy dippy about it, animals are just having different thought processes than humans, you know? And it's like questions about dogs. Like, I'm going off the rails. Please continue. I've gone too far off of the beaten path here.
Keep going.
Universal understandings.
Yes.
Dragons. Universal understanding. Communication. Creation myths. Stow that is stuffed. That's it. Everything else, not universal.
No, not at all.
None. Zilch.
God.
Tell me about this rolling head.
Oh, God.
He's my friend.
Head. It appears as an undead, disembodied head with long, tangled hair, and it rolls around the ground looking for humans to kill and devour. It doesn't exclude anybody. It's just there to have a good time.
Non-judgmental king. I love him.
I don't know if you've heard about the movie. I think it's called Rubber. About a rolling
yes, I have.
I love Rubber.
I also love Rubber.
I love Rubber. I shouldn't, but I love Rubber so much.
For anyone who doesn't know, Rubber is a horror movie about a rolling car tire that just blows things up.
People explode. It's great. I love
Just watch the trailer on YouTube. It's very fun. I sent it to my brother, and he's like, I'm going to show this to your nephew. And I'm like, don't.
No, they're sex.
Oh, no. Then there's Onyaten, which is a flying disembodied arm that sometimes serves as a boogeyman or is sometimes something that punishes badly behaved people. Those who speak badly of the deceased, pry into other people's business, or generally just cause problems on purpose.
What does he do? Smack him upside the head?
That's what I'm imagining.
Yeah, pretty much. Or take
Get
your
his
nose.
ass. Take my
It's gonna take your nose. And while I was writing this, I really never realized how many of these stories had to do with body horror.
Mm-hmm.
But they're all meant to scare you into being a decent person.
I love that. That's
So
good.
we're using body horror in a good way.
When your mom
Yeah.
wants to trick you and she just reaches her arm out from behind a door and is like, ooh. And you're like, huh. Fear.
I'll take your nose.
But like, funny to us, right? But if you encountered a disembodied arm, that terrifying.
No, absolutely.
The Addams Family real. Like...
Absolutely. I'm making light of a lot of these spirits, but in reality, if we were to see one, I'd shit my pants.
Update gamers, I'm number 12 in the queue. Just want to share that.
Congratulations.
Oh, congratulations.
I'm so happy for you.
This is... I really like... I think I just feel this way about any folklore, but I so treasure this, like, diversity of creatures and the purpose of stories of explaining the changes in landscape or the way the world came to be, or things as simple as, like, here is a flying disembodied arm that will punish you when you think maybe nobody else can. And there's something about that I really respect and I think is really wonderful and deserves more respectful recognition in this world.
Respect the arm.
The same way that Greek and Roman, and even to some degree Egyptian, Norse mythology is used. I feel like we don't appreciate Native American lore and myth so much. And maybe it's because there are so many, because like I know each tribe has a different creation myth and each tribe has a different group of gods and spirits that they care about and focus on, stuff like that. And I feel like I don't want to say it's underutilized, but I feel like it's only just starting to be explored. And I think a lot of the pieces of media that we mentioned are showing that it's possible. And I think, like all things, it takes time to kind of crack the code, quote unquote, on finding something that is a safe medium that isn't necessarily offendable but still can encourage people to explore it. Like I took a Native American lit class actually in college, and I think one of the things that struck me the most about it was that there's just such a vast array of lore to learn. There's so many just spirits and gods, and people talk about and who overlaps where and what small little... It's like when you're hearing a different story from multiple people, obviously you're going to get different perspectives of the story, yet it's passed down for generations and generations and generations, and the names slightly change, or the what happened exactly slightly changed. And I feel like there's so much to explore with that I really hope as time goes on that the collective consciousness can learn about this the same way that we learn about Greek and Roman mythology or Egyptian mythology, XYZ type deal.
But I think there's also a discussion to be had, too, about the way in which we've commodified Greek, Roman, and Egyptian mythology to the point of, like, not respecting it as a current-day religion that people still follow.
I was going to say that, too. Like,
very right, thank you.
There's a difference
Our good pal
between...
Jesus.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to make a joke saying, like, what if Percy Jackson put Christianity?
I've been reading webtoons, and I've been getting, and this is relevant, I promise. You said my good pal Jesus. I've been getting these ads that start, and they're just like audio ads. I can't find the video that they're playing to. They just start in the middle of me reading a webtoon, and they're like, have you ever been bullied? Jesus was. He gets us. He gets all of us. And I'm like, was he bullied? Is that the word we're going to use for it?
Bullied.
Jesus was bullied. When your youth pastor sits you down and he's like, I know you're having a hard time in school, Billy. Jesus had a hard time getting in school, too. And it's like, no, stop. Somehow I think we need to respect religion more? Question mark?
Fair. Yeah, fair.
But with utilizing Native American spirituality or tradition in modern pop culture, there's a huge difference between referencing something and honoring it and recognizing
Yeah.
it as its own thing.
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of things that do take from it, but don't see it. It's
That's
still
fair.
invisible to a lot of people, even though
Yeah.
it's very much in pop culture. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. Yeah. And maybe I'm a little bit of a dum-dum for even making that comparison, but I definitely get what you're coming from for sure. Yeah.
I think
There's a difference between like recognizing something and being able to identify and know where it's coming from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That context is so important because it's like if you don't have it, then maybe that elk imagery, seems odd and it's based entirely on the animal, right? But if you do have a greater understanding of the context of the book you two have read, then you can understand more properly the place where it's coming from and, I guess decide as a reader if like the intent behind that is good or if it fails. But I think if it's just this cry, right, to engage with a trope that you think is really cool and scary, then I think you've already failed in a lot of ways.
Yeah, good point.
Right.
Do you have any like closing notes or ideas you'd like to leave us on London or things you'd like to ask the audience to consider?
Basically, if you take something like the Elk Woman, for example, just because you're using it in your story doesn't mean you're honoring something. And I really need people to take that into consideration. Criticize the media that you're taking in. Is it just recognizing something and saying, oh, this is a Native American trope? Or is it being respectful and honoring it?
I think that's also the really important thing about having sensitivity readers. You can never have enough of them.
Exactly. Or having someone Native American on your writing team.
Oof, yeah.
Is there...
Or your production team.
There's no one on Antlers who is there?
There is someone in the movie that plays the one person that does the reveal. Who is... I forgot what tribe he's from, but I mean, that does prove that not all... Obviously, I'm not speaking from all Native American standpoint. Some people are okay with these things being talked about.
Yeah.
Some people are okay with a lot of religious things or a lot of things you're not supposed to talk about being mentioned. So, of course, I'm not speaking for everyone. There are people who are comfortable with that. And from my point of view, it's a little uncomfortable, or I don't want to say unfortunate, but it's kind of letting the tradition slip in a way. Because the traditions are so tightly held and they are so, like, with each passing generation, they slip more and more. And beginning to not respect those things by talking about them openly, we're losing more and more of the, I forgot the word, traditions and essentially what makes up being part of a tribe.
There's a difficulty, right, in the difference of preservation and sort of sustainable evolution. And I think because so much of Native American culture and heritage was destroyed or was lost, I would imagine that there is something even more deeply upsetting about seeing it maybe changed or altered too quickly or brushed aside too quickly when it feels like maybe it hasn't had its moment to sort of be preserved and respected properly, I guess.
Right. And a lot of these things can't be preserved because everything was verbal. Everything was passed down from generation to generation through storytelling. So a lot of things are just being written down now, but a lot of things have already been lost to time. And we're never going to be able to get them back. With each generation, too, less and less people are able to speak the language. And with COVID hitting, a lot of the elders that could speak the language are dying off. And that's been a huge problem on reservations. which means we're losing more and more of the culture and more of the language.
Yeah.
So being respectful of it in media is the very, very least that I can ask.
Thank you so much for joining us. This was a really wonderful and informative episode, and of course, all of our guests are welcome back. But I guess I would say if viewers have like really pertinent questions, we might just hit you up and steal you away again to come talk about them, because
That'd be cool.
yeah, I did see
That'd be
Chelsea
cool. I'll invite
sneak
her.
past in the background over there.
Oh, you did see
Yeah.
that.
Chelsea,
right?
I love you.
They say hi. She says hi.
Hi, Chelsea. Thank you so much. If people want to find you on social media or explore any of your work, where can they find you at?
I am on Etsy at Alpha Vulpeculae, and I'll have to write down a link for that. And I am also on Twitter at VoidPulse with an underscore at the end. And that's about all the places you can find me, I think.
Awesome.
Actively, anyway.
I will include a reading list down below, and I'll probably try and seek out some educational resources as well to include. This has been Author's Note. I said last time that I never do that, but now it's becoming a regular thing. So hi, this is Author's Note. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to help support the show, you can find us on Patreon and Ko-fi. We are Author's Note Pod on both of those platforms. And if you want to find more information about getting in touch with us, or information about the show, I guess, you can find that on authorsnotepod.com. But listening, leaving a review, sharing us with your friends is the best way to help the show out. My name is Cass, and you can find me pretty much everywhere on social media at Valhethella. That's VALHETHELLA. Tease, where can people get more of you at?
You can find me online at Vicuña, which is VICUNAD. You could also find me on Fandom Spotlight, a pop culture fandom news site. You could also find me on the Fresh Podcast Market, real podcast about fake podcasts that I host with friend of the show, Panda. Panda sometimes edits our episodes, and it's just an all-around good pal. Has been on a few episodes. Our theme music was done by James Wayulo. You can find him on Bandcamp under James Y. Don't forget, if you do want to support him, Bandcamp Friday is a thing, and Bandcamp Friday is really awesome because it gives more profits back towards the musicians instead of to the company itself. Cass, who did our cover art?
Our cover art is done by the wonderful and incredible Nyaliest. She has also been lost to Endwalker. I don't know how much she's played, but you can find her on Twitter at Nyaliest. That's NYALLIEST. Tease, you've escaped this week, but London, you're the victim this week.
Oh,
yes,
no.
Yeah.
thank God.
Oh, no.
So, what's something that doesn't have a fandom that you wish did?
Snake plants.
Hell yeah. What great little guys. You can really just put them in the bathroom and they're like, fuck yeah.
You can completely forget about them and they love it.
Love that for them.
Snake plant will be your low maintenance partner that we all deserve in this life.
Truly.
Until next time, everybody please get your booster. Microdose on the news. Be respectful of the media you are intaking and sharing and engaging with. You know, think critically. The shades are blue, maybe for a reason other than just being the color blue. But get your booster.
I got my booster.
Get your booster.
I got my booster.
I got my booster.
did.
Lynn, did you get your booster?
Not yet. I'm scheduling my booster.
She's gonna knock you on your fucking ass.
I'm ready. I'm ready.
I let Miss Pfizer and Miss Moderna swap. Ooh, Miss
Messy.
Pfizer, she's a zesty girl. Which, London, I have one final question actually. Why
Yeah.
the fuck does so much Native American pop culture include basketball in it?
I can't tell you. It's a native secret, and I can't tell you.
Damn, I understand. Respectable. Have a nice day.
Bye.
Bye.
They got mad ups, tease.